Hey, sleepy friends? Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from and how old are you? I love seeing our little map of listeners grow, one calm heartbeat at a time. If this story helps you unwind, a soft tap on the like button and a kind subscribe would mean the world. Settle in, get comfy, and let's drift back to a quieter morning. The day was still blue around the edges when the first sound found the porch. A soft clink, the kind that doesn't try to wake anyone, only to remind the house that morning is already gently happening outside. Tires whispered along the street, a hush like a secret being shared from driveway to driveway, and the air held that damp, grassy breath that rises from lawns before the sun remembers to be warm. Somewhere a sparrow cleared its throat in a hedge. The sky was a pale ribbon, and the world felt tucked in, yet the milkman, steady as a heartbeat, had already folded himself into the rhythm of the hour. Glass met wood, a small cool kiss, and even if you slept through it, something in you recognized that soft punctuation. I was here, I came by, the day can begin. The porch boards kept a memory of footsteps older than you. Grains worn, silky, under the paint. A hairline creak at the second plank where the house liked to sigh. On winter mornings, his breath rose like a thin cloud. On summer ones, the lids of the bottles wore a bead of living water that slid down the shoulders in a slow silver path. You could smell the faint sweetness through the cap, the clean dairy scent that felt like a promise. Breakfast will be simple and honest today, and there is enough. Sometimes a note was tucked beneath the wire handle, corners softened by sleep and humidity. One extra please in a hurried hand, or skip cream this week with a tiny star. He read them at a glance, pencil already poised at the ledger, numbers in the neat square print of a person who had learned to account for the world as it passed under his care. There was a choreography to it, almost invisible unless you watched closely. Truck rolls to a whispering stop. Hand reaches for the crate, fingers sure, nails pale with road dust, or knuckles nicked in the ordinary way of work. Bottles answer in the quiet clatter of a dozen little bells. Step, step, plank sigh, and then the placement. Not too near the edge where a gust might trouble them, not too far from the door so hands in slippers won't have to travel a cold mile of boards. Sometimes there'd be a cat, tail upright like a flag of curiosity, sniffing the wooden caddy and deciding with great seriousness whether the warm spot on the doormat deserved its thrown back. Sometimes there'd be a dog who had made a private peace with this early visitor, offering a soft chuff that meant I know you, and he would answer with a gentle, joking whisper no louder than the dew. If you were a child then, bare feet itchy for the world, the porch was a stage set that only needed you to pull back the curtain. You might have cracked the door open with the kind of conspiratorial care that makes hinges swallow their voice, peeking through the slice of cool light to catch him mid-ritual. The cap with the short visor, the jacket that knew each season like a second skin, the quick, efficient smile that didn't insist, just offered. He'd see you there, and without calling attention that could break the spell, he'd align the bottles so that the labels faced you, like soldiers at attention, names in handsome fonts that made ordinary milk carry the dignity of a family signature. You learned, without anyone saying so, that there were people whose whole job was to come when you were sleeping and set the beginning of your day gently in place. Inside, kitchens had their own dawn, a clock with a patient tick, a tin of tea whose lid had learned to rattle like a soft maraca when lifted, a table wearing yesterday ring of a wet glass like a faint watermark. The refrigerator, when it was there at all, muttered its low domestic hum, not yet the absolute monarch it would later become, but a helpful uncle in the corner. The bottles would come in sweating, slipping lightly in a towel-wrapped hand, condensation cooling the wrist. The cream line, creamy as a moonbeam, rested like a boundary between layers, and the paper cap with its tiny pull tab begged to be lifted by the kind of ceremonious fingers usually reserved for opening letters from faraway friends. Somewhere a calendar on the wall carried a pencil X over the days that had already folded, and in the margin an old note read, "Remember, Tuesday, extra cream for pie." For the Milkman, the route map lived in muscle and bone as much as on paper. There was Mrs. Alvarez with the hydrangeas that changed colour each summer, like a shy magic trick, who always left a saucer of water for neighbourhood birds and once pressed a still warm muffin into his hand without ceremony. There was the corner duplex where a war nurse slept late after night shifts. He set the bottles down like a lulled lullaby and never knocked, only tucked a slip that said "added one more" when she'd scrawled "please" on hers. Streets turned to habits, houses to names, names to human weather. A new bike helmet on a hook meant a birthday. A pair of crutches on a stoop meant a casserole would soon be arriving from next door. A rolled-up rug by the garbage meant a baby learning to crawl had demanded a safer landscape. He noticed without prying, knew without knowing, and the ledger in his breast pocket grew into a biography of the neighbourhood told in ounces and deliveries and little stars next to holiday bottle. Not every clink was the same. There was the December clink, crisp and bright as if the cold were a bell ringer, the bottle skins tightening under the stinging air. There was the July clink, gentle as a lull, when morning came already warm and the porch smelled like sun on paint and last night's tomato vines. There was the rainy clink, muffled by the umbrella's breath, drops ticking off the canvas like a metronome, keeping time with the town's still sleeping heartbeat. On those mornings, he would tip the bottles sideways to nestle them under the porch bench, where the wood kept a little dry cave, habits learned from 100 small storms, and the one big one that had made him vow never again to leave milk to the mercy of a sideways gust. You could mark the year by what gathered near the door. Winter mornings stacked with boots turning to spring ones peppered with school flyers curled at the edges, a baseball glove growing soft from use, a jumble of chalk nubs that left pastel hieroglyphs on the walkway, blue suns, hopscotch ladders to nowhere, cats with 3 triangles for ears. He did not step on the drawings. He placed the crate to the side, respecting the city the child had built in colour, before the rain would fold it back into stone. In that small care the day learned its manners. To begin gently is to begin well, and the clink taught it quietly over and over. Attention is a form of love, and love can be as ordinary as arriving when you said you would. Beyond the porches, the street itself knew his hour. Newspaper bundles sat tied like square loaves at the corner, waiting for hands with inked thumbs to scatter them into stoops and shrubs. The bakery's back door breathed out a cloud that smelled like crust and sugar and patience. A single light glowed in the lamplighter's house, even though the lamps no longer needed his match, and you could see the habit living on in him anyway, the way you can sometimes see yesterday's tide in the sand. Dogs made patrols with their people, both in robes and sneakers, both pretending they were on important business. The milk truck, a friendly shape with fenders that remembered another decade, rolled past with a low, polite rumble, like the bass line under a song the town only half remembered but could still hum. Sometimes the bottles on a given porch stood beside something that asked for more care. A casserole dish labelled in wax pencil, "Please return," a jar of coins for the school car wash with a note that said, "Take one and leave one if you can." A vase of cut zinnias attempting to outshine the devil-may-care orange of dawn. He would nudge the milk so it didn't steal the flower's stage, slide the coin jar inward where a careless elbow wouldn't meet it, tuck the casserole's lid so the breeze didn't claim it. None of this was in a contract. It was just the quiet rule of the hour. Set things right if your hands are free, and if you're the first awake, make the world a little kinder before the rest of us join it. Inside the houses he visited, alarms would soon bloom like small red flowers on nightstands. Kettles would begin their whispers. Someone would swallow a yawn in the yellow light of a bathroom mirror, and decide to be brave about another day. But for a few more minutes, the porch remained the stage for the day's kindest sound. Glass touched wood, wood learned the temperature of milk through the soles of the bottles, and the house, your house, any house, felt seen without ever needing to make a request. A pencil slid back into a pocket, a crate lifted, its shallow chorus answering the rising birds. The tyres exhaled again, the street accepted them, and the clink the milkman left behind hovered in the hallway of the morning like a note that hadn't yet finished ringing. Porches remembered people the way old trees remember wind, quietly through the tilt of a shadow and the soft habit of leaning the right way. Each front step had its own temperament, a concrete stoop that kept a cool face even in July, wooden boards that sighed like a kindly librarian, brick thresholds that held the day's warmth so long you could feel it under socks near midnight. The milkman learned these moods the way you learn the moods of a friend. He knew where the paint blistered, where the mat curled, where a bent nail might catch the hem of a robe. He learned which doors opened inward with a brave squeak, and which waited for a gentle shoulder. Names gathered on his tongue not as entries in a ledger, but as rooms he had visited. Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Duffy, the Hargreaves with twin boys who left marbles like tiny moons in the dust by the potted fern. Notes were the porch's private voice, and they spoke in 100 small dialects of ordinary need. Torn corners of school worksheets, envelopes turned inside out, a half-inch spine of a paper bag carefully smoothed and written on in eyebrow-thin pencil. 1 extra today, cream for Sunday, skip us, away visiting Aunt Nellie. You are kind. Some were decorated absent-mindedly, little daisies in the margins, a star, a box drawn around the word please as if to protect it from the weather. Rain crinkled them, sun bleached them, and sometimes a cat, feeling editorial, would sit on one and crease it with a decisive tail. He read each the way a pianist reads a familiar score, finding the rhythm at once, and tucked them, once deciphered, into the ledger where the day's music could be played without a missed beat. Dogs conducted an etiquette school at the threshold, some stern headmasters, some gentle assistants. At the red house with the clipped hedges, a bulldog with a face like a loved old purse would submit the milkman to a twice-weekly inspection, snuffling each heel as if reading a newspaper written since sent. All correct, his eyes said, and he would sit, a doorstop carved out of trust. Across the street, a nervous terrier conducted a ceremony of suspicion before allowing routine to win. The milkman adjusted his choreography accordingly. A bottle set down first, a quiet greeting second, a tilted head third, all as predictable as a lullaby. There was the elderly spaniel who had gone deaf and greeted everyone with the same cheerful surprise each time he saw their shape, rewarded by a palm opened at dog-nose height so he could smell the morning's story and be satisfied that it ended well. Babies had their own schedules, more sovereign than the town clock. He learned who slept through sunrise and who, like a tiny lighthouse, blinked awake at 4:30 to announce existence by way of a trumpet's worth of lungs. For the house with the colicky one, he padded the crate with a folded towel to soften the chorus of glass on glass, setting each bottle down like a secret. For the family where the baby had begun to sleep, praise be, he became a conspirator in the fragile truce between night and morning, arranging the caddy inside the circle of the doormats. There would be no knock, no creak, just milk waiting like patience's reward. Occasionally a bleary parent would appear in slippers and gratitude, hands making the universal gesture for volumes. Quieter, please, and he'd answer with a smile that understood without needing to promise a thing. Porches told time in their own calendar of objects. Winter meant boot scrapers and a thin lace of salt at the threshold. Spring brought muddy shoes and a bouquet of cut tulips, leaning like dancers during intermission. Summer set out a row of flip-flops in descending sizes, a small biography of a family's feet. Autumn piled gourds of improbable shapes like punctuation marks for a sentence about harvest. He stepped around everything like a guest who knew the house and loved it enough to avoid bumping the furniture. The porcelain bird beside the fern remained unchipped because he had memorized it as an object to be respected, even on mornings when the fog made the world a filtered dream and distances seemed a little unsure. In some neighbourhoods, the porches were open living rooms, a card table set with a half-played hand, a wicker chair with a lap blanket folded just so, a copy of last Thursday's paper with the crossword finished except for one square that had embarrassed the solver into leaving it blank. In others, the doors were like polite private faces, ready to smile but preferring that business be swift and tidy. The milkman matched himself to each tone. He knew which stoop appreciated a little tidying, the sprinkle of dead leaves brushed away with the edge of a crate, and which wished for its scatter to be left alone, a wild confetti that suited the morning. People left messages not only on paper, but in arrangements that were almost like offerings. A mason jar with a gratitude note, bills folded inside like shy birds, a shallow dish with a few chocolate coins and a label, for the kind early person. He rarely took anything, but he always lifted the dish to the bench, away from the wind, and set the milk down with a nod to the sentiment that made such acts possible. Sometimes there was a loaf of bread cooling near the screen door, quilted with golden squares, and the smell at that threshold had its own weather, yeast and heat and patience, mingling with the bottle's cool breath until the air felt like a blessing. Names came with stories. He learned them without gossip the way a gardener understands a yard. Mrs. Danvers, who lined her steps with mason jars of marigolds because her husband had once said they were ordinary and she was out to prove the ordinary glorious. Mr. Cho, who taught violin and whose porch sometimes held a music stand waiting for a student brave enough to bow in public. The Barneses, who painted their door a new colour each spring and asked opinions from passers-by with a formality that made strangers feel like judges at a fair. He had a way of greeting each person that belonged only to them. Morning maestro for Mr. Cho, a tip of the cap at the door as if it were a living thing for the Barneses, a hand over the heart, theatrical and kind for Mrs. Danvers, who pretended to scold him for carrying the crates as if they were feathers. The scribbled notes kept pace with the town's real time. Company tonight, double up, written with a flourish, and underlined twice. Son home from college, needs all the milk there ever was, written with a joy that cramped the letters into a gleeful crowd. Please share an extra with the new family 2 doors down, written in a careful hand that had practiced generosity for decades. He ran these smaller errands of kindness as part of the route, adding a bottle without comment, receiving with a nod the look that said you understood what we meant without making it a production. Then there were the notes of worry that made his pencil slower. No delivery next week. Surgery Monday. For those porches, he placed the bottles as if the simple act could steady the air, and in his pocket notebook he drew a small circle around the address, so he'd remember to linger, to be the sort of presence that made thresholds feel less alone. Every front door had a particular music, knockers that thudded with a small regal dignity, screens that hummed like a cicada when pushed, springs that rebounded with optimistic booings. He touched none of them unless invited, but he kept their songs stored up, a catalogue of entrance noises, in case he ever needed to announce himself without scaring the morning away. And there were the mail slots, thin mouths that coughed a brass hello when the letter carrier came later. And he coordinated his timing with hers in a partnership of strangers who knew each other's routes by the way coffee shop lights flicked on at 7 and which sycamore dropped leaves first. Sometimes porches gave counsel, a rocking chair empty but turned toward the street like a face that wanted to talk if spoken to. A chalkboard sign changing its wisdom by the week: be kind, leave room, share cookies, sprinkled with a dusting of last phrase across the next. He didn't argue with the chalk, he took it as an instruction manual for the hour and behaved accordingly. He left space where space made sense. He returned a fallen umbrella to the stand shaped like a brass cane. He set the bottles not as an imposition, but as an invitation. Begin here, with this ordinary goodness, and carry it inside. Neighbours made a braid of their porches by habit. The Hargreaves sometimes left a plate of snickerdoodles on Mrs. Patel's step when they knew she taught a difficult class on Thursdays. The Patels returned a bag of oranges when their cousin visited from Florida. The milkman noticed the exchange, admired the smoothness with which kindness changed hands, and occasionally served as the harmless courier when schedules misaligned. A plate balanced on his crate, a small scotch-taped note, a delivery made with the same care as glass on wood. In these quiet errands, commerce blurred into community, and the old word service recovered its first meaning, attending, as a candle attends a room by being simply present and steady. The porches taught him what mattered in a way that ledger columns could not. A swept step explained a birthday before the banner did. An extra pair of boots, tiny with bare faces on the toes, announced a visiting grandchild with more ceremony than balloons. An ashtray left untouched for 3 weeks told him someone had laid a habit down. A ribbon tied to the rail explained grief without a single syllable. He did nothing grand with this knowledge. He used it only to adjust his footfalls, his volume, his angle of approach, his willingness to leave a second later than usual, in case a door opened and a tired face wanted to say good morning to someone who wouldn't require conversation back. And then there were the names themselves, written in the milk company's book and also written in the roots under his skin. He pronounced them carefully, like small, important ships. He could spell them by sound, draw them in the air with a finger if asked. On holidays he added a card that simply said, "Thank you for your porch," meaning thank you for letting me be part of the invisible ceremony that starts your day. He was the custodian of thresholds, the keeper of notes, the reader of margins and mats, the quiet participant in a ritual older than refrigeration and younger than the idea that everything should happen without being seen. The porches gave him their small stories. He returned the milk, and in that exchange the neighbourhood found a way to feel like itself before the engines and errands and news headlines reminded everyone how wide the world can be and how easy it is to forget the names right outside the door. At first it was just a sound in the kitchen, a new hum settling into the walls like a cat choosing a chair. People stood a little to the side and listened, with the same polite attention they gave to the first song on a new record, wondering if this would suit the room. The refrigerator arrived in white enamel with rounded corners like a friendly appliance from a comic strip, a chrome handle that invited a palm, and a promise that felt almost supernatural. Winter, indoors, on demand. The deliverymen walked it through the doorway with careful backs, breathing a little, discussing the angle in low voices, like sailors easing a boat into harbour. When they left, the house stood still for a moment, and you could almost hear the old icebox exhale. The pan at its feet tired of catching drips, the block tongs relieved of their iron duty. The first thing families did was open the door and admire the light. A bulb, tiny and important, clicked into being every time the handle lifted, as if the appliance were a magician patiently repeating its trick for all comers. Cold spilled out, manufactured weather that did not ask the sky's permission. Shelves gleamed like bleachers waiting for the team to arrive, glass easy to wipe, wire honest and practical, the butter safe with its timid little lid, the door racks already suggesting a life of condiments not yet invented. Mothers took out dishcloths and polished what was already clean. Fathers pressed a hand inside and approved the sturdy chill with a grunt that meant yes, this is good. Kids left fingerprints like signatures on the brand new chrome until someone shooed them and then polished away their presence with a loving scold. New habits gathered around it the way chairs gather around a storyteller. Recipes changed their minds. Gelatin became ambitious. Salads took on a crispness that felt like a boast. Leftovers acquired dignity instead of peril. The calendar on the wall noticed fewer X's devoted to Ice Day, and the tray, once refilled by the man with the bell and the tongs, became a thing you froze yourself in neat domestic cubes. The word defrost entered the week, an afternoon with towels and patience and the satisfying crackle of frost surrendering. People learned to listen for the compressor's small on-off lottery, the way the house now had a heartbeat that was not human and yet cared for humans in a patient, mechanical way. In the grocery, aisles lengthened like a town claiming new land. Carts grew sturdier. Baskets remained for the stubbornly nimble. Labels bloomed like a garden of fonts. Cold cases arrived, glass-fronted and confident, and milk stepped into them wearing a new uniform, sometimes still in bottles, sometimes in cartons with the angular cheekbones of progress. The supermarket's air had its own climate, a faint exhalation of refrigeration that raised goose flesh even in July. Fluorescent lights buzzed a little like a chorus of agreeable insects. The floor tiles shone in pale checkerboard, a domestic chessboard promising you could outmaneuver hunger with a list and a budget. Announcements skimmed the ceiling in a voice that was nobody's neighbour and everyone's. Today's special, this week only, buy two get one. And the phrase everything under one roof, quoted from the newspaper ads, took hold of people's imaginations and moved in like a cousin. With cold on tap at home, the arithmetic of mornings changed. The panicked, we're out softened into we have enough, and the urgent scribbled notes on the porch thinned like fog at 10 a.m. Milk could wait a day or two. Cream could hide behind the butter safe. Eggs, which used to sit on the counter and watch the family go about its day, now leaned against cold walls like commuters on a train. The ledger in the milkman's pocket began to look more like poetry with too much white space, lines skipping where stops had been, addresses crossed out and moved to the edge of the page with a question mark. He still came, of course, to the faithful and the fond, but the route wore slimmer clothes, and even the truck seemed to roll differently, as if it were learning to coast through a town rearranging itself. Advertisements did the cultural translation, explaining to everyone what the refrigerator meant before they had entirely figured it out. Fresher, longer, promised a smiling couple who never seemed to sweat, even in August. Modern living, said a woman in pearls whose sleeves refused to roll up no matter how many pies she baked. Freedom, said the copywriter, a word that did curious double duty here. Freedom from spoilage, freedom from schedules, freedom from the small dependency that had once felt like a thread of community. In magazine cartoons, the old icebox became a lovable oaf, a relic who meant well. In catalogues, the new models lined up like dependable soldiers, deluxe, family, economy, each with a price that made sense if you squinted and believed a little in tomorrow. Kitchens changed their architecture to flatter the newcomer. Counters scooted to make room. Cabinets shuffled like courteous party guests. An electrical outlet appeared where none had been, a square mouth granting steady power from a river of copper in the walls. The refrigerator made the corner its throne and began to gather magnets and messages the way a tree gathers birds. Chore lists held by smiling fruit, a child's drawing of a very rectangular cow, a postcard from a cousin in a far state where the son supposedly behaved better. The door became a bulletin board for domestic governance, doctor's appointments, coupons clipped with hope, a small pencil on a string for adding items to the list, which itself was a scroll promising a future of ketchup and dill pickles and the luxury of always having 3 oranges. Meals drifted later because get that they could. The stew didn't mind being finished tomorrow. The custard appreciated an overnight. The gravy, in a jar, became a morning pleasure on toast that nobody admitted to. Nighttime stole a snack with a bravery unknown to the era of eat it now or we waste it. Midnight discovered the cold light, the jolt and the hush, the illicit insistence of cold fried chicken, the civilized theft of one more spoon of cream. Fathers conducted quiet raids in sock feet. Teenagers invented whole cuisines on bread at 1 a.m. Mothers, awake for reasons that calendars never mention, stood in the wedge of light and took one slow breath that belonged only to them. Behind the scenes, the town learned new jobs. Repairmen who spoke compressor and thermostat joined the guild of people you called by first name and paid in cash if you could. The power company printed newsletters in tidy fonts explaining load and off-peak and a new respect for storms. On windy nights, people listened to the lines sing and calculated how long the cold box could keep its promise without a sip of electricity, performing a domestic bravery that involved moving perishables like chess pieces and keeping the door shut with the discipline of monks. In summer, ice cream socials moved outdoors again because the freezer, bold as it was, still respected July's mood swings, and a gallon of vanilla asked to be shared before it remembered it had another state of matter to visit. Milk itself negotiated with progress. Pasteurization and homogenization, once arguments muttered at counters, were now understood as facts, like the calendar and daylight saving. The cream line, that pale horizon so many children had peered at through glass, often vanished into a consistency you could trust with your eyes shut. Cartons arrived with smiling cows and slogans that sounded as if the cows had hired agents. Plastic caps trained wrists to twist instead of pry. Paper pull tabs tore with a righteousness that sometimes required teeth. The kitchen learned new little sounds. The snap of a lid reseating, the tick of ice cubes evicted from the tray, the soft slap of a magnetic grocery list losing and finding purchase against the door. Supermarkets offered choices that measured themselves in yardage. Where there had been milk, there were now possibilities. Whole, 2%, skim, chocolate, buttermilk, powdered, evaporated, an orchestra of whites and creams conducting a symphony of recipes that no longer had to be played the same way each week. Aisle signs learned to speak in plural. Dairies, meats, shells, frozen foods. Frozen, another word that meant a different kind of future. Peas shining like green marbles, strawberries trapped in July for the middle of February, fish behaving as if the ocean lived one shelf over from the bread. Shopping lists grew not longer, but more confident, willing to plan 4 days out, then 6, then 2 weeks, if a paycheck and a trunk could handle the ambition. The mailbox felt the change too. Glossy circulars explained freezer organization as if it were a strategy game. Housewives, the magazine always said housewives with a cheerful certainty that looked tidy in print, were shown in diagrams how to rotate leftovers with a military sense of duty. Men were shown how to install shelves that never sagged. Children were shown how to beg for popsicles with a tone that would be tolerated forever because the box lived in the house now, not at the store's counter where a clerk might say no. Everybody learned to call food inventory, a grand word that made Sunday evening's rummage feel like an expedition into a well-managed pantry rather than a puzzle solved by luck. Meanwhile, on porches, the notes evolved. "We're trying the new place," wrote someone in a hand that hoped for no hard feelings. "Every other week?" asked another, negotiating with the modern calendar. "School begins Monday, back to usual," said a third, a compromise between old rhythm and new rhythm that sounded like a duet where neither singer needed to win. The milkman, practical as dawn, adapted by instinct. He offered cream less often when he saw the butter safe staying full. He swapped up a quart for 2 pints when the family composition explained itself in cereal bowls. He placed an extra on Fridays for the house where Sunday pancakes refused to bend to novelty and would always require the good stuff. The hum in the kitchen settled into a kind of companionship you could lean your back against while you tied a shoe. People started to store not just food but possibilities. A cake waiting on permission to become a celebration, a casserole staged for the neighbour whose luck had studied absence lately, a salad that would only improve by the time someone came home late. The refrigerator made room for tomorrow in literal inches and quiet degrees, an appliance that took time, which had once been brittle around food, and made it flexible in a way that let families exhale. The porch still felt morning in its boards, and the town still heard glass meeting wood in a few places where tradition held. But now, behind more doors than before, the little light came on at a touch, and the cold stepped forward like a polite host, ready to keep Siku safe whatever kindness you wanted to bring into the house and keep waiting there until you were ready to lift it out and make something warm. The morning he set out, the sky wore that particular shade of pale that makes the moon look like a watermark, and the truck's engine answered, with a low cooperative murmur, neither sleepy nor eager, only correct. He had folded his route sheet along the crease that years had taught it, pencil clipped in the margin, the paper softened at the corners from 1,000 pocketings. In the depot, the crates had given their small choir of clinks as he slid them forward, ice breathing its thin fog over the lip. He touched each bottle the way a librarian touches a spine, counting without counting, making sure the arithmetic of glass and thirst would match the day. A thermos of coffee waited by the handbrake, warm as a pocket. He took the first sip as the radio found a station with a song from 3 summers ago, and the dawn opened as if someone had found the right hinge. Streets at that hour belonged to a fellowship of early people. Line cooks and quiet cars, a newspaper man with the ink already on the ball of his thumb, a jogger whose breath stitched little white flags into the air. The truck learned again the route it would never need teaching, steering itself almost by memory toward the corner, with the elm that had finally given up after last year's storms, toward the cul-de-sac where the pavement held a puddle shaped like the state of Ohio for half the year, toward the narrow alley behind the grocery that always smelled faintly of oranges and soap. He liked to catch the bakery's back door yawning open. This morning he did, and the warm breath that came out was sugared and yeasty, a promise that even the furthest houses on his list would be met with kindness long before the clock could prove it. He parked at Mrs. Alvarez's first, as always, because her hydrangeas kept time better than the church bell. She was already at the window with her watering can, hair pinned, housecoat buttoned with the careful dignity of a uniform. He placed 2 bottles, a cream, and slid the folded note she'd left last time, granddaughter visiting Friday, into the ledger with a tiny star that meant remember to ask about the piano recital. She lifted the can in salute. He tipped his cap. The geraniums in the box under the sill had gone for a brighter red this year, a decision they and she had clearly reached together. He had once moved the bottles an inch inward so the neighbour's cat wouldn't consider them part of its kingdom. He did so again without thinking, a choreography that hadn't needed rehearsal in years. At the Duffy place, the screen door kept its usual low hum, and the front step still tried to scuff a heel off anyone who didn't know. It kept a nail lifted like a whisker. He should have been able to do this blind, he thought, and for the most part his hands agreed. A note sat under a chip saucer. 1 less. Doctor says we're trying the other kind. He didn't need the rest of the sentence to read the whole story. Modernity had tapped on their kitchen door too. He arranged a single bottle with a certain persuasion in the angle, as if neatness could stand in for a second quart, and wrote the subtraction with tidy numbers that respected a new arithmetic without sulking about it. Farther down, the street learned a new kind of quiet at the house, with the new baby that somehow still smelled of sawdust from a winter project. He had padded the crate with a folded towel for them for months, a small curtain against the chorus of glass. The towel went down again. The bottles disembarked as softly as feathers. A father in a shirt that claimed to be clean and a face that didn't claim sleep slid the door open with the kind of care that hoped hinges might agree to keep their thoughts to themselves. "You're a saint," he mouthed, and the milkman answered with the conspirator's shrug that meant we are all saints in this hour if we act like it. On the mat lay a baby sock no longer than his thumb, and he placed it on the chair where even the dog wouldn't sit. A crown returned to its cushion. The ledger pages that had once been crowded with lines now breathed a little more. There were spaces where there used to be numbers, a white geography that told a story as clearly as words. He flipped, penciled, tucked, and the pages made the dry leaf noise that belongs to any job that understands its own age. He had thought when he woke that he would remember every detail with a valedictorian zeal, but the work refused ceremony. It asked only to be done well, like any morning. The truck took the hill by Hargreaves Park with a patient gear. The tyres introduced themselves to the same pebbles they always had. The sun selected a brighter vowel for itself, and the houses answered by tinting slightly to gold. He knew where the sidewalk insisted on buckling, where the maples sharpened their shade like a pencil, where the paperboy flung with his left hand and therefore left the folded news a touch to the right of the stoop. At the Patel house, he found their chalkboard sign resting on the chair with the wisdom of the week dusted across the bottom half. Begin as you mean to go on. He smiled at the sermon and aligned the labels so they faced the phrase, thinking that if milk had a way of reading, it might stand a little taller for having absorbed the counsel. From the second window, a violin untangled scales like a bird rewinding sunlight. Mr. Cho's student had put the stand a fraction too far to the left and would discover a soft breeze bending the paper like a slow bow. He placed a hand on the corner of the stand through the screen and scooted it an inch toward calm, the sort of unasked favour there is no verb for except the old one, neighbour. When he reached the corner duplex, the nurse's porch had traded the crutches for a cane. He set the bottles down as if a sleeping wrist lay beside them, signed the ledger with the same flourish he always used for a household that worked nights, and stepped back into the street with the turn of man who refuses to wear heavy shoes on the floor of a sick room. Behind him, the sparrows held committee in the hedge. Ahead, a newspaper slid to a stop with a slap a boxer might admire. The truck took him to the little house that had once belonged to the widow with the blue scarf. A couple lived there now, their mailbox wearing a new surname in cheerful block letters that still looked a little like they were borrowing a suit. They had gone to Carton's, he knew, seduced by endless shelf promises and the idea of a store that stayed bright past dinner. He slowed anyway, as a body slows past an old school and then let the truck keep its pace without argument. He checked his watch without thinking, the way you touch your keys on a crowded platform. Everything matched. The angle of light on the Hargreaves mailbox, the two joggers at the corner trading a water bottle like a hail relay, the dog at the yellow house lifting one paw at a time in an aristocratic refusal to step on dew. At the Barneses, the door had become a shade of hopeful green. Mr. Barnes stepped out with a brush in his hand and an expression of a man who has decided that paint is philosophy. "What do you think?" he asked with the seriousness of a bridge builder. "It looks like the kind of green that believes in Saturday." The milkman said, and they shared the sentence like a snack. 2 bottles, no cream, and the brush went back into a jar with the ritual care of a man returning a violin to its case. On maple, he found the little kindnesses he always found. The plate of cookies travelling toward the substitute teacher. The mason jar of coins asking the world to contribute to a school trip. The lonely umbrella rescued from an ambition to roll off the steps. He moved what wanted moving, left what wanted leaving, invented no moral where none existed. At the corner with the barber shop, the first haircut had already begun. The chair tilted, the cape swaddling a man who closed his eyes not from trust but from enjoyment of being handled kindly. The air smelled of talc and talk. He slid 2 bottles behind the shop door, where the apprentices would find them and measure their morning by the weight in their hands. He stopped just before the hill for his thermos, lifting it with a gratitude that never learned to be showy. Coffee carried a taste of the depot, of metal shelves and rubber mats, of men who spoke in short sentences and remembered birthdays. He took a swallow and watched the town hop more decisively onto its feet. Buses turning into buses, a kid on a bike negotiating the tightrope between independence and gravity with a grin, A woman in a coat choosing a hat from a hook with the drama of a remembered dance? He wiped the rim with his sleeve, the way he always did, and moved the thermos back to its seat like a reliable passenger. There were places still where the milk waited to be received like a letter. At Mrs. Danvers's he placed a cream and imagined the pie that would recruit it. She opened the door with flour on her hands and asked whether the new moon would do anything strange to the hydrangeas. "Only if you ask it nicely," he said, which made her laugh, and she handed him a muffin that was too hot by 2 minutes, but refused to let that trouble the present. He broke it with careful fingers and ate it leaning against the truck, letting crumbs enroll in the street the way stars enroll in the sky, casually and in great number. He wrote a tiny D in the ledger's margin, his private mark for muffin, and turned the page. He knew he would wave to the boy on the red bicycle near the end of the second loop. He did, and the boy wove briefly like a fish showing off for a river before straightening under the invisible hand of a parent's training. At the house with the wind chimes that pretended to be a philosopher, the breeze made the simple metal tongues ask their reasonable questions, and he answered by setting the bottles in their customary triangle, a geometry he'd found years ago that satisfied the porch's proportions. He passed the school just as the flag unfurled a little, and the custodian paused to look at it with the respect of a man who appreciates fabric when it behaves itself, and he nodded without slowing, as if the flag and the nod had an agreement not to be theatrical about it. The truck's bed began to feel lighter in an honest way, a way that said the town had been addressed and the conversation was proceeding. At the top of the long street that lifted toward the water tower, he placed his hand flat on the crate a moment. Not from sentiment, but from the small engineer's pleasure in the rightness of a decreasing load handled evenly. The ice smoked a little in the tray where the sun reached it. He slid the block an inch toward its shade and watched the little fog surrender like a stage effect. Down the hill he could see Mrs. Patel's chalkboard catching a noon that had not arrived, the letters steady. A breeze flipped to the corner of his route sheet like a page in a book eager to be read, and he settled it with the pencil, the gesture so worn into him that he could have done it in mittens. He thought then about the lunch counter that would pour him coffee if he wanted it, the way the waitress would mark the cup's rim with the ring of her pot like a halo that belonged to anyone who asked. He thought of the depot again, the men who would talk about a game none of them had watched, and all of them had known the score of since last night. He thought about the afternoon, when the power company would visit his street to put a new transformer on the pole, and how his own kitchen would hum a slightly different hum after that, progress with a fresh key. He didn't think about much else because the intersection was arriving, and intersections require attention, and attention was the trade he knew, as necessary as cold, as quiet as glass when it meets wood and does not complain. He put his foot where it belonged, coaxed the truck through the turn, and let the next porch step forward with the patient confidence of a place that knows it will be met with exactly the right number of bottles and the correct angle of the labels, a pencil mark to seal the pact, and the retreating whisper of tyres that accept the street as a given and the work as a pleasure done properly, one measured clink at a time. At first it was hard to say what was missing, because missing is often an echo, not a silence. And echoes take a moment to realise they are not the thing itself. The porch woke at the same hour it always had, learned the same temperature from the air, smelled the same lawn dampness rising in a green sigh, and yet the beginning of the day stood slightly off its mark, like a picture frame a thumb's width crooked. Someone getting milk from the refrigerator heard the rubbery kiss of the seal instead of the light clink that used to write the first sentence. Someone rinsing a mug listened to the tap's metallic thread and felt, without assigning words to it, that a comma had been misplaced in the paragraph where morning usually introduced itself. It was practical, of course. The new way was tidy. Milk waited indoors behind a polite door. You didn't have to step outside in a robe and socks. You didn't have to negotiate with the wind or the suspicious interest of the neighbour's cat. You didn't have to move the bottles in under the bench when rain arrived sideways. The floor didn't learn a circle of damp under the caddy. The towel didn't acquire the holy job of drying glass shoulders. The cream line didn't tempt small fingers to tap the bottle and marvel at that pale horizon. And yet the day, taken entirely indoors, lost a step that had once made the house and the street shake hands over the threshold. A small ceremony had concluded without witnesses and without scandal, and the lack of scandal was part of the strangeness. Nobody complained. There simply wasn't that particular clink. And in its absence, the mind, which is a collector of minor bells, wandered the porch looking for a sound it could no longer schedule. Those who still woke early found themselves hearing other things that had always been there, just backstage. The back porch finch, previously a single bead on a string of morning sounds, now hung brighter in the air. The radiator, its small percussion and argument with winter, made itself known like a careful drummer. Somewhere a delivery truck rolled past without stopping, its brakes exhaling a tired opinion that did not belong to your house anymore. The distant, patient thud of a newspaper landing 2 doors down rose in the rankings. The refrigerator's quiet cough, on, off, became the home's heartbeat instead of a metronome tucked behind the score. And the porch, left without its appointment, grew into an empty stage that invited the eye to rehearse the old scene. The hand, the crate, the triangle of bottles, the fraction of breath held while the glass settled. Children, who had learned a neighbourhood by its thresholds, noticed the change in the way they notice adult haircuts, suspiciously and then as new fact. The walk to school felt shorter because one of its stations had been removed, like a bus route that cut a stop people used without knowing they did. They passed steps that used to hold 2 pale bottles sweating modestly, and saw instead a doormat with a cheerful command, "Welcome!" doing more talking than usual. They did not revise their day around it. They simply rewired a map, replacing the early bottle with the later aisle. Where milk stood regimented under a fluorescent noon that existed in all weathers. Their memories kept the old pictures and added new ones, and the seam between them looked tidy until a teacher asked everyone to draw the sounds of morning, and a few drawings showed little bells clustered near front doors, and a few others showed a rectangle with a light inside it, and both were true in the moment they were first drawn. Neighbours also shifted their timings, almost without deciding to. Where you once met Mrs. Alvarez in her housecoat with a watering can at her hydrangeas, you now saw her by the dairy case inspecting dates with the resolute air of a woman who had decided to learn a new alphabet. Mr. Cho, who kept lessons to a train schedule, began to shop on Tuesdays and decided that the store's ceiling music was only tolerable in the top of the hour. The nurse who worked nights discovered that walking the aisles at 10 in the morning felt the way the town used to feel at dawn. Empty enough to hear your own thoughts, but without the soft grammar of clinks and pencil on a pocket ledger. The routines that had netted people together with a measured rope now connected inside a building that did not remember their names, and they learned to be their own memory, which is a grown-up thing, and also a lonely one when performed at scale. Letters to the milk company were brief and polite, written in the voice people use when breaking up with someone they still admire for being themselves. "We've so appreciated your service," wrote the Barneses in their hopeful green door house. "With the addition of a new refrigerator, we'll be discontinuing home delivery at this time." At the depot, forms were processed with rubber stamps that said words nobody disliked. Completed, changed, final. The ledger in the milkman's pocket asked for fewer pencils, then an eraser, then a paperclip, and still the pages turned with that dry leaf noise that says a job has known weather and will accept it. He took roots that grew thinned out and then tidy, then took other work, the way a river accepts a new channel while still remembering its old bed as a scar bright under sunlight when the level drops. Porches themselves grew more private, which is to say they remembered their first job, keeping the outside out and the inside in, without resenting the more social position they had for a while carried. Mats asked you to wipe your feet, but no longer greeted a specific arrival. Notes moved from under the caddy to the refrigerator's door, where magnets shaped like fruit made domestic constellations. the little caretaking gestures the milkman had practiced, tucking a casserole lid tighter, shifting a coin jar away from the wind's opinions, siding a vase into safer shade, now belonged to whoever opened the door first in the morning. And sometimes the wind had its way, sometimes coins met the porch's slant and travelled, sometimes a vase learned to be more careful. The neighbourhood didn't fall apart, it simply became a little more dependent on the owners of things to notice them, and the noticing happened slightly later in the day, with coffee already poured, the mind already divided between headlines and socks. You could feel the change at the bakery too. The back door still breathed its warm sugar, and early risers still happened upon it as a benediction. But the milkman no longer turned down that alley at the same minute, and so the brief exchange, the nod that said, "You keep the sweet warm, I'll keep the milk cold," lost its easy rhythm. The baker didn't grieve, not in a way that required black armbands or eulogies. He simply sliced more loaves for the lunch crowd and learned the names of 2 new delivery drivers who brought dairy and eggs to his walk-in as regularly as tides and were very kind, but did not know which hydrangeas in town kept better secrets. The barber clipped through the first cut of the morning under the same dust of talk and talc, and the coffee at the lunch counter still arrived with a halo on the cup, and yet the opening pages of the day had turned into a different chapter, and you could tell by the way people leaned over the counter, just a fraction more forward, as if asking the hour to speak a little more loudly to make up for the missing bell. Inside houses, certain gestures disappeared without fanfare, and the body noticed before the brain did. No one bent to lift a sweating bottle from a cool shadow beside the door. No one folded the towel along the crack in the porch where the boards like to drink. No one opened a paper cap with the reverent pinch usually reserved for letters. A new choreography replaced the old. The hand reached for the chrome handle, swung the door, felt the light welcome the wrist. The carton's lip clicked, the plastic cap twisted, the jug groaned softly as liquid moved from one cold shelter to a ceramic horizon. It was fine. It was good even. It was consistent, which is one of the names we give to love when we have to keep a lot of balls in the air. And on certain mornings the mind, which cannot help being a museum of small pasts, laid out an exhibit, a wire handle cool against palm, a dew bead travelling the slow spine of glass, the faint bell when bottles nudge like polite family at a reunion. The quiet grew new rooms. Newspaper thuds took centre stage. The neighbour's screen door declared itself with the voice of an old tenor. The school bus exhaled and inhaled at the corner with exactly the same patience, but now its sighs marked the start rather than the second act. Wind chimes, which had always asked philosophical questions and been answered by the clink, found themselves conducting the conversation alone for whole minutes. Sparrows tried on louder roles. The mail slot, late to mornings, occasionally made an early cameo when the carrier beat the clock, and its brass cough felt like a substitute teacher reading from a familiar book. People discovered that if they stood very still at the threshold and closed their eyes, they could hear their own houses more distinctly. The soft cotton shiver of curtains, the refrigerator's steady weather in miniature, the faint tick of a cooling oven left from last night's roast, the long inhalation of an empty hallway. Some friendships adjusted their choreography too. Where you used to see Mrs. Danvers at her porch with flour on her hands and a question about the hydrangeas, you met her in the dairy aisle arguing cheerfully with a carton about expiration dates as if the tiny printed numbers were negotiators. The conversation was shorter because aisle time costs different currency than porch time. You are cold and aware of blocking traffic. You have 8 thoughts about the rest of the list, and yet you smiled with the relief of recognition. There you are, still in this neighbourhood, still considering pies as a form of civic duty. A few of the old gestures survived indoors. People continued to set aside an extra for a neighbour, only now the extra travelled in a bag carried across a driveway at 6 p.m. instead of being tucked inside a wooden caddy at 6 a.m. The kindness did not die, it learned a new hour. Even the town's animals filed quiet complaints in manners only they understand. The bulldog with the handsome old purse face substituted a new patrol route that paused meaningfully at the spot where the crate used to sit, then took a disappointed sniff at the doormat as if reading a column that had been discontinued. The cat who had once appointed herself inspector of condensation realised the cold now lived behind a door she could not open and gave the door an elegant blink that said, "If you have changed the rules, I shall change my interest." The sparrow committee in the hedge continued meeting unbothered. The dog at the yellow house lifted one paw at a time regardless of clinks because due remains due and aristocracy remains aristocracy. The supermarket tried earnestly to be a town square and sometimes it nearly succeeded. A bulletin board near the entrance bloomed with guitar lessons, lost mittens, babysitter credentials, a flyer promising a Saturday bake sale that would reconcile the football team with its uniforms. The intercom voice, friendly, perpetual, developed cadences that occasionally resembled gossip in the old way. Peaches on sale, a spill on aisle 5, Margaret to check out 3 please, which meant Margaret's laugh would be heard at 3 potatoes deep. And that was not nothing. Still, aisles are lanes, not porches. They are optimized for motion and choice, not pause and recognition. People learn to say hello quickly, to move on, to complete lists. They became good at finishing mornings without assistance. They did not forget the clink. They filed it where the mind keeps lullabies available, transporting, unrequired, and yet on some days, perhaps for no reason better than weather and the way a certain shaft of light lands, someone opening the door at dawn will pause on the threshold and look down at the rectangle of porch as if expecting a message left by a respectful stranger. The eye will measure the distance from mat to rail. The mind will place 2 bottles and a cream in the geometry of habit. The ear will prepare the tiny bell, and the fingers will, for the smallest part of a second, curl in the shape made by a wire handle before remembering themselves and reaching for the chrome instead. The door will close, the refrigerator will offer its crafted winter, the mug will fill, and breakfast will go about its honest work. Outside, the porch will remain itself, holding the air, receiving the morning, ready in case anyone needs to set something down and pick it up again. A stage awaiting a sound it can no longer schedule and yet still knows by heart. The milk changed outfits and the mornings changed music, but the invitation inside the old ritual never really left. It just found new doors to wait behind, new hands to travel with, new ways to arrive without being loud about it. The clink became a tap, the soft tap of a neighbour's message. "I'm making soup, do you want a jar?" It became the chime of a phone that, when treated kindly, behaves like a tiny porch bell, not an alarm. A place where someone down the block asks whether you've seen their tabby and someone up the street offers extra basil because their windowsill garden believes in miracles. It became a calendar square not labelled delivery, but check on Macho, and a habit of setting aside one more muffin than the house needs, because abundance wants a job. The old circuit, door to porch to hand to kitchen, reappeared as a triangle drawn on a different paper, message to errand to doorstep, with kindness as the wire handle that doesn't leave a mark on your fingers but shapes your grip all the same. We learned new choreographies that kept the old spirit's balance. Community-supported agriculture boxes started appearing on stoops like wooden vowels, each week a syllable of lettuce and peaches and soil. A volunteer lifted one onto an elderly neighbour's chair and tucked a recipe card into the lid written in a large friendly script. "This is how I do the chard." The grocery driver, efficient and polite, left bags exactly where the wind wouldn't argue with them, and sometimes, if he knew the house, added a quiet reminder, the eggs are on top, with the same measured reassurance once used for glass. Families created little libraries on posts, birdhouse tall and glass-doored, swapping novels and picture books and pamphlets about seed saving, and the exchange hummed with the precise electricity that used to live in a dairy crate. I leave, Uto take. We meet by not needing to be home at the same time. Porch lights learn to signal again, 1 click for we're here, 2 for come by if you like. A strand of winter white bulbs left up in July, not as decoration, but as a standing invitation to be human at this address. Inside kitchens, the new sanctuaries of cold and list-making, old courtesies translated themselves. A jar of jam acquired a label that said, "For Matteo," for passing the exam, and it waited on a shelf with more anticipation than anyone allowed themselves to feel out loud. The refrigerator's door kept a neighbourhood of magnets, and among the pizza coupons and orthodontist appointments there appeared notes that were not tasks but acknowledgements. Mrs. Alvarez's hydrangeas, blue again, Barber's baby, first tooth. Garbage day moved to Thursday, which was not a moral thing and yet mattered, because it kept the rhythm shared. Children took up the job of watching for changes, the chalk messages on the Patel sign, the new paint at the Barnes's, reporting them with the seriousness of sports scores. 2 pumpkins appeared. Mrs. Danvers has a cat with white feet. The violin student now plays a song with a real ending. In this way, belonging became homework and pleasure, a subject you ace by paying attention and a test you never finish, which is the best kind. The new clinks were seasonal, as the old ones had been. Winter taught us thermoses again, carried to a neighbour shoveling a drift that had decided to be taller than sense. Spring redistributed seedlings as if they were male. Cucumbers to one porch, marigolds to another, a tomato plant to the house with the south window and the faith to forgive hornworms. Summer brought lawn chairs into the front yard where they had not sat for years because we thought we'd outgrown them. It turned out we had only mislaid them. People faced the street with books and iced tea and the long-form art of nodding to passers-by, and the town stitched itself up with threads of, "Oh, hi, and good evening, and that cloud looks like a ship. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does." Autumn returned the favour with apples in paper bags left at doors with a pen-scrawled note. "We picked too many. Please rescue us from ourselves." The rescue arrived by dusk, and the bag's paper learned the shape of gratitude again, a very dignified geometry. Technology, which people like to blame for every frayed rope and also praise for every miracle, discovered it could be a milk route if someone told it how. Group chats turned into invisible alleys where help travelled quickly. A map marked with care tasks became a ledger soft at the corners. A calendar sent polite bells that reminded you your neighbour's surgery was tomorrow, which is not a fact to note and forget, but a request to make soup and fold a towel over it so your hands and the pot both arrive safely. When a storm knocked out the wires and the humming winter in the kitchen went quiet, the old skills raised a hand. Share the ice, put perishables on the porch like a 19th century experiment, check on Mr. Cho who keeps a battery radio, move the medicine to the neighbour's generator, line up coolers like a makeshift choir, and fill them with goodwill and the practical stubbornness of people who understand that comfort is both a private and a public project. The tradespeople, the human infrastructure, kept the tradition's backbone upright without calling it that. The letter carrier learned who needed the mail brought to the bench and who wanted it tucked under the frog-shaped weight. The recycling driver honked once, not loud, on the birthday of the kid who insisted on waving every Tuesday. The woman at the lunch counter poured a halo on the cup for the volunteer who had been out since 6, tying bright ribbon around the town's new saplings so nobody mowed them by accident. The barber kept a coffee can under the counter marked team uniforms and did not publicise its existence. The coffee can nevertheless remained never empty, because people pretended to pay for shaves that had already been paid for by the day's softness. None of this was organised by a committee, and all of it had a ledger somewhere, even if that ledger existed only in how easily one person's name came to mind when another person asked, "Who could use an extra dozen eggs today?" Packages on porches, so many cardboard promises, darted wearing handwritten sidecars, Leave this at the greens if we're not home. If raining, tuck behind bench, thank you. Familiar next door, birthday. Please hide under the chair. Couriers, whose time is mapped in seconds, became briefly the new milkman when they took a half step extra to make sure a box didn't announce itself to weather or opportunists. Some left a quick drawing on the delivery photo, a smiley, a tiny bottle shape, because they'd heard the story from an older colleague, which was corny if you didn't need it and exactly the right temperature of human if you did. The ring-ding of the doorbell camera started to behave like a version of the soft clink when its footage told a calm story. A hand, a placement, a retreating figure who behaves as if houses deserve respect. We found that care has ranges like radio frequencies. On the high bandwidth, there were the visible efforts. The food train when grief parked itself on a block. The fundraiser jar on the counter that jumped from coins to generosity in a weekend. The couch-dragging committee that got Mrs. Alvarez's love seat up the stairs without damaging the wall or their friendships. On the low bandwidth, there were the gestures almost too small to tell. Nudging the stray trash can lid back onto the can. Turning a lost mitten so its palm faced the street and might catch its partner's eye. Moving the Tuesday paper from the wet edge of the stoop to the dry. Wiping the top step with the toe of a shoe when frost laid a thin trap. All of these were clinks, a language polite beyond hearing that nevertheless speaks. There were reinventions that gloried in their obviousness. A porch that had been only decorative blossomed into a once-a-month instrument called tea and tools, where neighbours brought a screwdriver or a kettle and traded an hour of fixing a thing for an hour of talking about the other thing, the one that lives behind your face and makes you press your lips together before you answer too quickly. Someone painted the steps with 3 rectangles labelled SIT, PAUSE, WAVE. Someone else put a bell back, an actual bell. Brass with a rope pull to be used only by children and emergency, and the particular kind of adult who still remembers knocking and run as cardio. The bell sounded nothing like glass on wood, and yet the air recognised it as a cousin, because both sounds located you in a community where the right to announce yourself comes paired with the duty to be gentle. Old objects found second seasons, and with them new purposes. The wire caddy that had ferried breakfast through 1,000 dawns began to carry library returns in one house, herb pots in another, a set of mason jars filled with neighbour stew in a third. Bottles that would have held cream now held candied orange peels, or last year's sand from a beach too far away to visit often. Caps became game pieces. The ledger, softened to suede at the edges, turned into a family's gratitude log, pencil columns filling with phrases that look like inventory and behave like prayer. Sun on the floorboards at 9, the nurses laugh, the way the mail slot sounds when it doesn't stick. Mrs. Danvers's pie invented a new standard for lemon, which is not theology but will do when theology is busy. Schools taught kindness a little more explicitly, as if remembering that home economics used to mean more than measuring flour. A classroom kept a porch box, items students could borrow and return for people at home, a jar opener, a spare set of measuring spoons, a booklet on how to read appliance warranties without falling asleep. The librarian set up a Milkman shelf for books people had read and wanted others to find by accident, the best kind of a recommendation, and put a note on it that said, "Take, return or pass to the porch that needs it." The band director taught dynamics, and some kid took the lesson outside, discovering that sweeping a sidewalk quietly at dawn is the same principle as playing mezzo piano. The world hears care best when care is not bragging. We practice noticing again, which is almost the entirety of the old ritual. Notice the hydrangeas, notice the chalk drawings, notice the new paint at the Barnes's, and say the exact sentence that makes Mr. Barnes believe in Saturdays. Notice who is up early and who is late for good reasons, and shift your noise to fit their hour. Notice which porch step is untrustworthy, and warn the package driver with a taped arrow and a friendly "step here." Notice that the violin stand by the screen door will catch the breeze and slide it an inch toward calm. Notice that the bulldog's route now includes a pause where the bottles used to be, and use that pause to scratch a square head and say all correct, which perhaps means nothing, and perhaps means the whole town feels its gears meshing, and we learned to anchor the day with small sounds on purpose. A spoon against a mug at the same minute the milkman used to visit. A radio click to the station that still insists the world can be summarized without being trivial. A shoe stamping the mat in the exact rhythm of 3 measured clinks. Hello, hello, hello. Some houses installed a simple wind bell that wasn't precious. It sounded when the air decided to say something nice. Some houses left the door open just wide enough for the morning to shake hands with the kitchen for 30 seconds. Some people stepped out with their coffee, not because they needed to fetch anything, but because their feet remembered that the front of the house is where the day used to introduce itself. And introductions, even after all these years, still work better when you make them in person. None of this demanded costumes or parades. It asked only for rehearsal the way any ritual respects practice over performance. The milkman's virtue, arrive when you say, set things gently, know the names without making a fuss, turns out to be transferable to nearly everything that matters. Deliver quiet, confirm presence, tilt the label so it faces the door, keep a pencil that writes on damp paper, carry an extra, accept muffins too hot by 2 minutes. Wave to the boy on the red bicycle without insisting he stop and explain his joy. Align the morning so the next person's first act feels like the second line of a poem that was already good before they got there. The clink may be memory, but the care that tuned it is present tense, and it lives wherever thresholds decide to be generous, which is wherever we decide to notice, to show up, and to set the day down where hands will find it without searching. Thank you for wandering through this quiet little history with me, through porches that still remember footsteps, kitchens lit by small moons, and the gentle choreography of neighbours who show up without making noise about it. If your eyelids are heavy now, that's perfect. Just let them be. If they're still bright and curious, you can linger with me for one more slow breath. In, like the cool of a morning doorway. Out, like the hush of tires moving on. I hope somewhere in the spaces between the words you heard your own street again, the way the first bird tests the air, the way a familiar hinge clears its throat, the way kindness makes a sound so soft it can be mistaken for silence, unless you remember to listen. Before you go, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me about the small, old rituals you keep alive without thinking, the ones that feel like tying a ribbon around the day. Tell me whether your town still speaks in porch language, or if it learned a new dialect and you learned it too. Share the names you carry on your tongue like a neighbourhood map. The barber who knows your cowlick better than you do, the baker who slides a muffin into your morning and pretends it isn't a ceremony, the neighbour whose porch plant changes colours like a secret keeping its promise. If you grew up with bottles sweating in the shade, what did the clink mean to you? If you didn't, what sound does your morning use to begin? Ice in a glass, a kettle's whisper, the friendly sigh of a bus a block away. The comments are our shared stoop. Leave a note under the wire handle of the internet and I'll stop by to read it. If this little journey helped you unwind, I'm grateful for the quiet company we kept. A gentle like is the digital version of setting the bottles just so. A subscribe is like leaving a light in the window so we can find each other again on some future evening when your day needs soft edges. Tap the bell only if you want the smallest chime when a new story arrives. No alarms here, just a porch bell tone, the kind that feels more like an invitation than an interruption. And if there's someone you know who might sleep better after hearing that ordinary life is still beautiful in all the right places, you can send this along the way you'd pass a jar of soup to a doorstep. No fanfare, simply because it might be needed. Tonight, if you're settling down, let the room dim to that gentle blue hour where the corners become friendly and the clock learns to whisper. Ease your shoulders down into the pillow as if you're easing a bottle onto cool wood. Think of 3 small kindnesses, the kind with no hashtags, no labels, just the weight of real glass and real hands. Maybe it's the way you folded a towel so it would catch a drip no one else would have noticed. Maybe it's the way you set a cup for someone before they asked. Maybe it's the way you paused at your door, looked at the street, and decided to belong to it for 1 extra minute. Those are clinks too, and they ring in a key that calms the nervous parts of the day. When morning comes again, it will do what mornings have always done. It will touch the threshold first. You can meet it if you like. Step to the door with your coffee, feel the wood cool under your feet, and greet the hour with the same soft confidence the milkman used to carry. Arrive when you say, set things gently, know the names. If you're leaving for work or for a walk, try a tiny experiment in the science of being a neighbour. Align something so the next person's hand can find it. Tuck a note where kindness will trip over it and smile. Tip an imaginary cap to the sky just to see if it tips back. The day will notice more than you think. It always has. And for now, let this channel be your porch light. There are more stories where this warmth came from, more quiet histories of ordinary miracles, more maps drawn in pencil on the palm, more ways to remember that the distance between houses can shrink when we decide it should. You're welcome to return whenever you need a softer landing or a slower beginning. Until then, sleep if sleep is ready, rest if rest is what you've earned, and carry the small sound with you, the one that says, I was here, I came by, the day can begin, because even at the end of a story that sound knows how to keep you company. Steady as breath, kind as glass meeting wood, gentle as a promise kept.